There have been many chemicals that have changed the course of human history. We saw how tin changed the world by denying Napoleon to conquer Russia in an earlier episode. Today we will look at another such chemical that is white in color but has a very dark and black history. It may be sweet, but its history leaves a very sour and bitter taste in our mouth. Yes, we will see how the chemical named sugar caused millions of people to lose their freedom and ended up being slaves and died. Hi, I'm Anand, and if you're new here, please subscribe to Pale Blue Thoughts, the channel which debunks pseudoscience and promotes scientific temper. We all know of the chemical called sugar. Some people crave for it so much because of its sweet taste. But did you know that sugar is one of India's most important contributions to the world? Yes, we gave the world sugar. Sugar has been cultivated in India since before the Common Era. Sugar was derived from sugarcane plants, which is native of tropical areas such as the Indian subcontinent and Southeast Asian countries like Indonesia. Chinese manuscripts dating from 8 BCE mentions the use of sugarcane originated in India. There are historic accounts that mentions that the secret of preparing sugar from sugarcane plants also originated in India. Indians knew the method to make crystalline sugars and also its heated version, good or jaggery. Ayurveda uses sugar in many of its preparations. Sugar remained relatively unimportant until the Indians discovered methods of turning sugarcane juice into granulated crystals that were easier to store and to transport. Crystallized sugar was discovered by the time of the Gupta Empire around the 5th century CE. In India, these crystals were called khand, which is the source of the word candy. Traveling Buddhist monks took sugar crystallization methods to China. Chinese documents confirm at least 2 missions to India initiated in 647 CE to obtain technology for sugar refining. In the Indian subcontinent, the Middle East and China, sugar became a staple of cooking and desserts. Travelers from India carried clarified butter and sugar as supplies and introduced the knowledge of sugar along the various trade routes that they traveled. Slowly, sugar reached Europe around the 16th century. Up until then, Europeans mainly used honey as their sweetener. Sugar in its crystalline form from India suddenly gained a lot of popularity in Europe. In those days, it was a very expensive product that it was even called the white gold. Indian sugar was very popular and scored higher than Arabic sugar during the early CE era. Earlier in the 12th century, Venice acquired some villages in Lebanon and set up estates to produce sugar for export to Europe. By the 15th century, Venice was a chief sugar refining and distribution center in Europe. Later, sugar started to be grown in places like Madeira, Sao Tome and Canary Islands. But there was this all-consuming passion for sugar which swept through the European society, and these small societies couldn't cope up with the demand for this sweet chemical. It was during this time that Christopher Columbus collected sugarcane samples from Canary Islands and took it to the New World, the Americas. They were first planted on a West Indian island named Hispaniola in 1501. From then on, sugarcane plantations appeared in Cuba and Jamaica. The Portuguese took sugarcane to Brazil. By the 1600s, Brazilian sugar production overtook that of Sao Tome, where sugar was first manufactured in Europe. English planters first began growing sugarcane in Barbados in the 1640s using convicts and prisoners from the British Isles and enslaved people from Africa. By this time, this white chemical was taking the world by a storm. Sugar mills kept popping up everywhere in the West Indies and South America. The demand for sugar contributed to creating colonial systems in areas where cultivation of sugarcane was profitable. This posed a new problem. They needed workers. The process of cultivating sugarcane and then making sugar from sugarcane is a laborious process. This demand was met from Africa. Millions of Africans were enslaved and shipped across to the New World to work in sugar fields and sugar plantations. They were not taken there because of their color, as many assume. They were taken for their strength. They sowed, tended and harvested the crop and then worked to extract the juice from the sugarcane and boil and process the juice in order to turn it into sugar and molasses. Later, they might work to distill some of the waste products into rum. Now you know why Caribbean rum is so popular. The sugar plantation was both a farm and a factory, and enslaved men, women and children worked long days all year round. Young men and women were made to join what was called the first gang in their late teens, but within 10 or 12 years, the hard work would have wrecked their bodies and they were relegated to the second gang, which worked hard but not as hard as the first gang. After perhaps 20 years in the second gang, a person now about 40 years old would appear old and worn out and would join other old people and young children in the third gang, which weeded the crops and gathered weeds and grass as feed for animals. White owners and overseers watched over all these processes using whips, and they used them to force enslaved people to work harder. Once harvested, the canes had to be processed quickly, for if left too long, the juice inside the cane would spoil and become useless. As a result, during harvesting and boiling season, the slaves of the first and second gangs worked harder than ever. The canes were taken to the mill and enslaved men fed the canes back and forth between the rollers, which crushed them and allowed the juice to be collected. This was dangerous work, for these men were often exhausted and sometimes they did not let go of the sugarcane in time and their arms were drawn into the rollers. When this happened, an axe was used to chop off the crushed arm. Some plantations had many one-armed men who had suffered this fate. Finally, after all the processes were over, the semi-refined sugar was dried in the sun, packaged and sent to Europe and Americas. The white men who owned the plantations knew that this tremendously hard work would exhaust many enslaved people, that they would die young. The average lifespan of an enslaved sugar plantation worker was only 7 to 9 years after their arrival in the Americas, but it was estimated that they would reach break-even after just 4 years because the labor came very cheap. Each year, a planter brought new imported slaves from Africa to replace those who had died. This process was known as triangular trade or triangle trade, and it involved 3 legs of a journey from Europe to Africa to the Americas and back. Goods like copper, cloth, guns and ammunition were sent from Europe to Africa. Enslaved people from Africa were sent to the Americas, and finished goods like sugar, molasses, tobacco and cotton from the Americas were sent back to Europe. The demand for this sweet chemical called sugar literally drove the transatlantic slave trade, which saw 10 to 12 million enslaved people transported from Africa to the Americas to toil on sugar plantations. This voyage was called the Middle Passage and was notorious for its brutality and inhumanness. Ships were overcrowded and overheated. Slaves were chained together and forced to endure disease-ridden, cramped and torturous conditions. An estimated 15 to 25% of enslaved Africans died before reaching a shore. World consumption of sugar increased by more than 100 times from 1850 to 2000, which is led by Britain. In the late 18th century, Britain consumed about half the sugar which reached Europe. After slavery was abolished, the demand for workers in the Caribbean were filled by indentured laborers from the Indian subcontinent. Indentured servitude is a form of labor in which a person is contracted to work without salary for a specific number of years. It is estimated that around 2 million Indians were transported to various sugar plantations across the world. They were called coolies. That is why in places like Fiji, Mauritius and some places in the Caribbean, Hindi is still an official language. The descendants of the early indentured laborers continue to stay in those countries. A quick look at the percentage of black population in the US will tell the story of how much of an influence this sugar and slavery trade had made to the history of the world and to its ethnic diversity. It did more to reshape the world than any ruler, empire or war had ever done. So this chemical, which draws its roots from India, led to one of the most barbaric times in human history until it finally settled into being a household commodity in every household in the world. So the next time you pick up that spoonful of sugar to add to your coffee or tea, remember that this chemical in your hand has a dark and deadly history to tell you. A history of human enslavement, wicked tortures, and premature deaths of millions of human beings. I hope you like this episode. For more such content, please subscribe to Pale Blue Thoughts. Also share, like and comment so that this information reaches many more eyes and ears, and YouTube algorithm would pick this and show it to more people. I shall be back soon. Until then, it's bye-bye from Pale Blue Thoughts.